Hello. You are listening to the DD Geopolitics podcast. We are joined by a returning guest we are very honored to have back, Mr. Chay Bowes, a journalist for RT, are joined by Chebu and also by Lydia. Welcome all.
Hey, great to be here.
Good morning.
We are very happy to have you. And of course, we're very happy to be back.
So today we will be talking about a few things. Some recent developments have happened, in particular one which affected our guest, and that is actually quite momentous, and for those of us who watch politics can't help but fill one with envy to have such a great privilege. Mr. Bowes, along with Grey Zone's Max Blumenthal, had the privilege and honor of addressing the UN Security Council on the 29th of June. You can actually find this meeting of the Security Council on the UN Press's website, and you can go and watch it, and we would all encourage you to do that. And also, more recently, just this past week, NATO had its much touted, much vaunted, much celebrated, much anticipated Vilnius Summit that instead we got what will soon be a very, very famous picture of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky standing on stage, bearded, tongue slightly out of his mouth, looking very bitter. So, a picture is worth 1,000 words, they say. Often very trite. A picture is often just a picture. But this picture was something exceptional. But we'll be talking about all of that, and you'll be getting to hear about all of that. So, Mr. Bowes, could you tell us how you came to have such a great honor of actually being able to address the UN Security Council and in such a venue actually get to set out some facts to anybody who is watching and listening?
Yeah, well, of course, it was a great privilege, even though, the UN has really become quite a talking shop. Like you say, the key thing here was that it was an opportunity to express some reality in a forum where they had to listen to us. And in conjunction with Max, we were asked by the Russian delegation to do a briefing, and so something that happens quite often, I think, in the UN. They ask people who they believe have experience and something to offer, I suppose. I think any member of the Security Council can do that. Max, obviously, as a journalist with exceptional experience and knowledge of the American political ecosystem, having grown up in it, running the Grey Zone, which is really probably, in my view, one of the foremost non-aligned, non-client media outlets in the United States, possibly in the world, and Max is the engine of that. So it was super to sit and be with Max. We didn't collaborate at all prior to this because we decided that we would not do that. So that was also interesting. I was asked by Dmitry Polyansky, who's basically the second in command, if you like, of the UN delegation from Russia. He asked me, would I be interested in doing a briefing on basically the proliferation of weapons and small arms into Ukraine. And why did he ask me? I suppose it's because I've a bit of a background there. I have a modest military background. I spent some time in the Irish Army, in the Irish Army Medical Corps. And post that, I had licenses in firearms appraisal, and, I had a lot of time and experience with small arms and ammunition. And I also did a master's degree in strategic studies and specializing in war, the politics of war, the geostrategic realities of war as well. So I kind of have some badges where I could express an interest or an opinion about this, basically this saturation of Ukraine in weapons. So that's really why they asked me to come along and give the briefing. Of course, I imagine they asked me because I have a dissenting view on how this war began, who began it, who created the conditions, built the scaffold which it's blazing on, and who's stoking it today. So I'd imagine they asked me because they believe my views would align with theirs on what's really behind this proxy war in Ukraine.
We watched your presentation with great interest, and I think we would like it to definitely touch upon some areas of expertise that you demonstrated, I think, very, very powerfully. So often the focus recently has been on the cluster munitions that have been supplied by the United States, but actually you brought up an issue that is not talked about so much, but that we think is very well worth bringing up, namely all the small arms weapons that have been distributed not just to Ukraine, but throughout Ukraine by the Ukrainian government. Could you tell our listeners why that's so important and why that could potentially be so devastating for the country, even if the war were to stop now?
Sure. Well, I mean, shockingly, the Ukrainian government, or lack of government, because in my view, no competent government would do these types of things. They would not saturate. I mean, prior to the Russian military intervention, which I like to call the latest chapter in a conflict which began with it probably began back in the late 1940s after the Second World War, when the nation CIA began to fund and arm ultra-nationalists like Bandera, Shukevich in eastern or western Ukraine. But the culmination of that, I suppose, was Newland and Pyatt's engineered and designed coup in 2014, which led to essentially the arming and empowerment of disproportionately powerful far-right groups, people like Oleg Tyanybok and various others, the establishment and the growth of Aidar, Tornado, Azov, which prosecuted a very brutal ethno-nationalist sort of civil war in the wake of the Odessa Union House siege. The people in the East very quickly saw what was coming. Russia went into Crimea, of course, which, of course, the West says it was an annexation of Crimea. Of course, you have to ask yourself, was Crimea Russian before Nikita Khrushchev handed it as a present to the Ukrainian SSR in 1954? So there's this, you have to take all of this in the sort of Western perception of the good guy, bad guy, Star Wars narrative. So post that, of course, the conflict erupted again, I suppose. And in February 2022, and very soon afterwards, a panicked Ukrainian government began to basically dump hundreds of thousands of small arms weapons, millions of rounds of ammunition, hundreds of thousands of grenades, RPGs, RPG-7s, mines, anything basically that was in the country's Soviet stores out onto the streets. And as I mentioned in my speech, on one occasion, just outside Kiev, 18,000 weapons were given out to any civilian that could carry them. There was no age checks. There were kids as young as 13 given weapons, I was informed. And this is all verified by Ukrainian media and Western media. So you had teenagers given PKM light machine guns with thousands of rounds of ammunition, Makarov pistols, 9mm pistols, millions of rounds of ammunition, SPD, sniper rifles, an immense amount of weaponry. And one of the comparisons I made in my speech was when the IRA, which I would be familiar with being Irish and having grown up in Ireland during the 1970s, during that war in the north, when the IRA actually decommissioned its weapons, and it was a General de Chastelin, who was a Canadian guy, I think, who was in charge of that, they only actually had about 1,000 rifles, assault rifles, in their armory. And a couple of tons of Semtex, which is a plastic explosive, which would have been very useful for them in the kind of war they were fighting. But regarding rifles and small arms and weapons, they had a relatively tiny amount. So the comparison I made was the IRA challenged the British state on the island of Ireland for 30 years, killed thousands of British paramilitary police, hundreds and hundreds of British soldiers, destroyed significant pieces of British infrastructure with a very small armory. And considering the saturation of Ukraine, its porous borders with the rest of Europe, its abject corruption, which I went through in some detail as well, with the State Department reported to Ukraine's, endemic corruption in a report that the Americans actually commissioned in 2019. You can see where I was going with my argument, that even in the event of a settlement, 4 or 5 guys in the back of a bar can quickly access anti-aircraft missiles. They can access anti-armor missiles. They can launch a very succinct and lethal assault on a vehicle carrying a high-ranking official from one other side. So when you've got a society which is post-conflict, and then it is saturated culturally, absolutely in these weapons, even in the terms of conflict, there are hundreds of thousands of weapons now lying in fields, in ditches, unfortunately alongside the corpses of Ukrainian young men and some Russian men as well. So there's a lot of weapons in the country. It takes one AK-47 to assassinate an official. It takes, less than a quarter of a kilogram of Semtex explosive. It takes one RPG rocket warhead to attach to a drone for a kid to fly into an aircraft. It takes one Stinger missile to bring down an airliner full of people. So this was the point of my argument, that this reckless, untraceable, untrackable flooding of Ukraine with weapons by the Ukrainian government, but more lately by the NATO countries, who are energetically dumping their dysfunctional junk from their armies, their post-Soviet armies. Because remember, the Ukrainian army that was created by NATO post-2014 was essentially an army that was trained on Soviet weaponry. It wasn't really capable of using Western weaponry because they didn't have any, but had a large stock of Soviet tanks from T-64s up to T-72s, some T-80s. Its air defense system was basically the Soviet S-300 system, essentially. And that's all been destroyed now. So the only equipment that tanks these guys know how to use, the BMP, they're all trained on the Soviet ones. So the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, all energetically have been dumping their old stocks of Soviet equipment into Ukraine. It's being destroyed wholesale, but they're doing it on a very cynical basis. And I called it immoral at the UN. I said it's quite immoral that what has been portrayed in the media as the countries helping Ukraine is basically them trading up by dumping basically third-rate equipment into Ukraine, which has been, basically vaporized by the Russian army.
So what you have spelled out by using the benchmark of how armed, or relatively speaking unarmed, the IRA was, which is to say that just in Kiev alone, 18 times as many small arms rifles, that is to say just one element of small arms, along with their ammunition, were distributed in Kiev alone, to say nothing else of elsewhere in the country.
On one afternoon.
So what do you think could possibly be an outcome from that postal war in terms of what that could unleash, even, as I said, if the war were to stop where it is, with the front lines where they are right now?
Okay. Well, another analogy, another interesting comparison would be the treaty that was signed in Ireland. And when the IRA basically, we had a revolution in 1916, which failed. It was basically crushed by the British. They executed the leadership, and in doing that, they turned a groundswell of anger toward the rebels into a groundswell of support for them, for this nationalism. So they executed the leaders, and then this war of independence began, which was basically a guerrilla campaign by the remnants of the IRA that fought in the revolution against the British. They embarked on a very skillfully executed campaign of guerrilla warfare against the British-esque, by sending paramilitary police and units like the Black and Tans into villages and towns in Ireland, committing atrocities, which further accelerated the fighting. The one thing that the Irish side was desperate for then was weapons. But as you can see, in the aftermath of this, the British said, okay, let's have a treaty. There was a treaty signed, but the treaty led to a civil war in Ireland because some people wanted the whole island. The deal of the treaty was that the Ulster counties, the Protestant counties of the north, would remain in the United Kingdom, and the Republic would be granted status within a sort of a British Union. So it was a step towards full independence. It was very small stocks of arms that allowed dumped arms that had been dumped at the end of the treaty, basically, to allow this civil war to escalate. And it was a brutal civil war, and it led to thousands of deaths. And it's an interesting analogy. If, for example, there was a settlement tomorrow, if everything froze where it was, you could easily have groups on either side. I mean, I don't see Azov, Tornado, Aidar, Right Sector, or any of these ultra-nationalist Ukrainian paramilitary groups, which remember now have access to weapons, have had access to weapons, even if they're told to dump their arms, which in military parlance is to basically dump your weapons, drop your weapons, consign them into some central authority. Even if they're asked to do that, 500 weapons, some anti-armor, some anti-aircraft, you can prosecute a war. We've seen recently in Russia how access to weapons and equipment can challenge the civil power. And we've seen very patently here in Russia how when you allow arms, armor, and anti-aircraft capability to be held outside of the remit of the state, how dangerous that can be for the exercising of civil power. And that's in an established, quite strong society here. So imagine what it would be like in Ukraine. Are you going to get agreement from the same people who whispered to Zelensky, about Minsk? It was, I believe, it was the radical right in Ukraine, which wields a very highly disproportionate amount of power for its size, actually, but does yield that they actually essentially threatened Zelensky regarding Minsk, that there wasn't an inch of ground to be given to the Russian separatists, as they were called. So this was a small group influencing at a very high level. With the amount of weapons that are now in Ukraine, there are innumerable groups now that can influence violent, disproportionate power into decision making. Combine it with endemic corruption. Vast amounts of money, I believe, and sources have told me that hundreds of millions of dollars in cash in US dollars have also circulated into Ukraine. This is how CIA fights its wars. We know that the CIA is basically operating the nerve center of the conflict on a sort of commissar level politically. It's also interfacing with the far right. It's interfacing with Zelensky's regime. It's also carrying the nerve synapse signals, if you like, throughout the whole system in Ukraine regarding signals intelligence, etc. So there's a lot of money, there's a lot of corruption, and there's a shitload of weapons. And it's not necessarily a T-72 tank that could do the damage, or a Su-25 fighter. It's not that type of stuff. That's very difficult to maintain, to fuel, and to move. What's easy to move is an AK-47, one of the most devastating weapons ever created, exceptionally efficient as a killing machine, and it can withstand incredible amounts of abuse. I fired the gun, I've seen it stripped down, dumped into mud, and put back together, and it still fires. This is why it's a favored weapon of revolutionaries and what some call terrorists, some call freedom fighters across the world. And there are literally innumerable hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these weapons all over the place in Ukraine now. And there are tens of millions of rounds of ammunition for it. And again, these guns were designed to survive lying out in the open for 2 or 3 years and still being able to fire, as is the ammunition. Soviet equipment was designed to work. And Western equipment was designed to be sold on other markets, essentially. That's the sort of a maxim you could kind of work by. So it's very difficult to sterilize these weapons out of Ukrainian society now. And you've got an incredibly unstable political situation, an incredibly corrupt country. And of course, then you've got the proliferation of these weapons beyond Ukraine's borders. We had Benjamin Netanyahu, not somebody I'd be a big fan of course, recently saying that the reason he wasn't sending weapons to Ukraine was because his intelligence people told him that, Stingers and Javelin anti-armor missiles have been seen circulating among the enemies of Israel on its borders. So if that's not a validation of my point, I don't know what is.
A very, very good point, I would say. Another thing that I at least was struck by watching your presentation and Max Blumenthal's presentation was how well you set out the facts, and actually how well you set out how this narrative that's been very, very relentlessly spun in the West, that this was an act of unprovoked Russian aggression. It's just an absolutely contextless, senseless invasion. By the response that Sergei Radchenko gave to you and to Max Blumenthal, and first, not just in how dismissive he was, but also him starting to basically, at least as I would characterize it, say some slogans without any reference even to what you said or attempt to refute what you said. And just even in contrast to that, immediately after him came the ambassador, and he actually refuted some of the points that Radchenko had to say. Now, why do I set this all up that way? Which is that on the one side, you appear to be prepared for an argument and to deconstruct that argument, whereas Radchenko is a professional historian, but it was like he was speaking as though you had said something else than what he'd said. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, my view and Max's view, and I've discussed it with Max this in a very minor way, and I suppose some other observers and some other people who were in the chamber on the day, they are of the view that Radchenko and the British ambassador, the American ambassador, and all of their sort of feudal ambassadors who are led along by the British and the Americans, that the reason they didn't engage with us is because the fact we lay out are irrefutable. All of the sources I used in my discussion, and this is very much, I did this on purpose, everything I said was sourced from Western data, everything. Nothing was opinion-based. It was all from Western media, from the New York Times, from the Guardian, and most importantly, from the US State Department, from Interpol, from Israeli sources. So, I mean, it's impossible for them to refute their own data. And this is something a very smart professor told me a long time ago. It becomes like garlic to a vampire. There was no way they were going to try to debate Max or I, and this is no way me being, high-handed, aloof, or trying to big myself or Max up. But we're talking about facts. Radchenko was talking about opinions, and this is the basis on which this whole insane war is being prosecuted on opinions. There's no real interrogation of fact. There's an a la carte attitude to the morality of whether this war was began on the 24th of February last year, or what the background to it is. It's essentially a courtroom where the victim gets to appoint all of the evidence. The victim gets to say, this happened. No one's allowed to query that evidence whatsoever. It's like a body turning up with 1,000 stab wounds, the head cut off, burn marks all over it, and the judge saying this is the worst case of suicide I've ever seen. So the forum by which they would actually debate us on facts or on evidence is anathema to them. It's absolutely terrifying. It's like garlic to a vampire. They would never dare to debate Max or I. Not because it's me. There's much wiser people than me, and I would dare say Max Blumenthal scholars who have long predicted this conflict, long pointed out the realities of what has caused it, what's perpetuating it, and everybody knows it, and even the dogs in the street know it. Interestingly, Max Blumenthal or somebody on his team actually mentioned to me that they overheard the French ambassador, sort of queued up to lambaste us along with everybody else. They all wrote in, except for the Chinese and some of the African countries who Max for our presentations. The rest of us queued up with their, unipolar drivel speak condemnation of us as, paid stooges or whatever, the usual drivel. But the French ambassador was overheard saying that he hadn't even listened to Max and I. He wasn't even in the chamber, but he did turn up to condemn us. He didn't even hear what we had to say. I offered to debate the Ukrainian ambassador, who Irish media approached afterwards and said, well, what do you make of what Mr. Bowes said. He said, I don't want to hear anything from Mr. Bowes. I don't want to know what he had to say. So I have offered to debate him in any forum, in any country. I'd fly there anywhere. I don't think I'd probably make my way to Lvov at the moment, though I might not make the return ticket. But I suggested I would debate him in any forum. And of course, there's never a response to that. And I've offered that debate to anybody. I said, without any notes, I'll sit in the forum. You can ask the questions. You can have a panel of people, and we will debate this mano a mano. But they consistently reject that opportunity. Now, I don't know what that tells the guys listening to this, but it suggests to me that everything I've said is, cannot be challenged because its basis is their data. Now, of course, the West has decided to memory hole all of its views about Ukraine, all of the realities about the UN's views on the proliferation of weapons, all of the realities of Interpol's views on the proliferation of weapons, and all of the realities now on the use of cluster munitions, where the United States banned their use, essentially a de facto ban since 2016. But now it's decided that it's morally prudent to further saturate the earth of their ally with the most heinous and malicious weapons, these little bomblets known to mankind. That's the reason they've been banned, is that they're absolutely a very pernicious, nasty weapon. So again, it's an a la carte attitude now to morality, and there's no crime unforgivable. There's no cynicism, and there's no rule that can't be erased and rewritten when it comes to fighting your proxy, be it Russia and soon to be China. So this is the reality, and they know it in the chamber. But it's a question of the emperor's clothes. As soon as somebody actually admits this thing is, it's essentially a race to the bottom. A cynical idea to destabilize Russia has now become a monstrous sort of vacuum, which is demilitarizing Europe. I mean, America would not be sending cluster bombs that had in storage for maybe 30 years to Ukraine. It just would not be doing that if it had any weapons left to send. And I wrote a small post on Twitter, actually, in response to one of your tweets, guys, and I said, these cluster munitions are essentially not very effective against fixed positions. They're not very effective against buildings or armor. They're kind of outdated. They are very dangerous for farmers and school kids in decades to come, just ask the Cambodians, the Vietnamese. But this is a real sign of desperation. Many NATO countries have banned them. The British even actually came out and said, look, we don't think this is a great idea. There's serious consternation and concern about it. But it's also, in some ways, if you look at it, it's also a signal that they don't really believe that they're going to recover the territory that Russia currently has, or maybe the territory that may be, further gained by Russia now, as Russia, I think, strategically looks at the reality that we'll probably have to push further to at least have a 60-kilometer buffer zone from the republics that have been absorbed into Russia, in order to prevent long-range missile attacks and artillery strikes, because they're not going to allow a situation to pertain in the future, as has pertained in Donetsk city, where every day, and my friends are there, and a good friend of mine, Steve Sweeney, is there right now. Every day, the city is getting indiscriminately hit with Grad rockets and NATO artillery shells. So the reality of this thing is that you could cynically suggest that Ukraine is agreeing to fire and the Americans are agreeing to provide them for two reasons. Number one, it all got left. And number two is that they really kind of recognize that this will be left as Russia's problem, because it's highly unlikely, as I said in my tweet, actually, that Ukrainians will have to advance through these things should they succeed to do what they're going to do, which they're not going to do. And they'll also have to be pushed back through them. So the reality is potentially, and this is just, maybe an observation of my own, that the Ukrainians believe that this territory is lost. They actually do believe that, and that it will be Russia's problem to demine it or to deal with it afterwards.
Certainly, and there will be plenty of concern trolling from any number of disarmament campaigns funded by just the right sort of people about how Russia's senseless war caused this, never mind who actually supplied the cluster munitions, and never mind who it was that in the summer of 2022 decided to look the other way while the VSU spent artillery ammunition it complained it didn't have shelling downtown Donetsk, including firing its own stock of Soviet cluster munitions that scatter these little pedal mines, which took me aback because I think anybody who's seen the joint Russian-Ukrainian film from 2005, Nine Company, says they actually discuss how these munitions were used in Afghanistan by the Soviet army. And the movie doesn't say, well, because the Soviet army's doing it, it's cool. It says, we're doing this, mostly it blows up goats and kids, and it's evil.
Yeah, they're a very pernicious weapon. Of course, and we've seen the results of that in Donbass. My friend, again, Steve, he's down there now. He's been down there for the last couple of months. And, he's been trying to raise money for a kid who's lost his leg as a result of one of these, and I've been in Belgorod and Shebek, and I've seen what NATO artillery can do to just ordinary houses, shops, people's lives. I've sat with these people, and I also finished my talk at the UN by telling the delegates that NATO weapons are being used against civilians, and I've seen that. And that it was incumbent on me to tell them to do what they can in their own countries, even if they won't overtly say it, to end the war, to end this war. And I suggested that it was now for London or Washington to decide whether this war ends on the battlefield or around the negotiating table. It's gonna be one or the other. But I'm living in Russia now, and I of course there's differences in opinion about the war, but I think regarding the reality of the outcome, it's only hardening here as to the reality that this threat cannot be let pertain, it can't be let persist, that there's going to have to be a peace which guarantees Russia's security. Everyone's talking about Ukrainian security concerns, right? The ones that really matter are going to be Russia's security concerns. What is Russia going to allow? Because Russia is winning the war. I mean, the delusion, the scale of the delusion in the Western media, particularly BBC, CNN, is remarkable. I mean, I watch it every day because I like having high blood pressure. I turn it on every day to watch the mastery of delusion, the deception by omission from the BBC. They're very, very good at it. And when I hear people like John Simpson saying, we're winning, what is Ukraine going to do when they win? I mean, it's just insane. I mean, these defenses in southern Ukraine or along Zaporizhia, these lines, these are they're impermeable. They can't be breached by anything that NATO has or Ukraine. And again, what I said to open my speech in the UN, in the Security Council, was the following. I said, what began as NATO supporting a Ukrainian army is now a Ukrainian state supporting a NATO army, because with ever dwindling manpower and ridiculously unviable armor and tanks. I mean, as I said, most of this equipment. You release the Leopards. These Leopards are geriatric Leopards. A lot of them are 30 years old. They're too heavy for the Ukrainian steppe. They sink. They're too big a target for the Soviet anti-armor system, the Kornet, these new systems, the Ka-52 attack helicopters are just eating them alive, literally. But this now, of course, is being melted. What do we do next? The West is out of options. Russia has demilitarized NATO to a great extent regarding ammunition. You can use infantry alike, but you need ammunition, and this has been proven to become an infantry war and an artillery war, and the whole Russian military doctrine is based on artillery. The Soviet Union, remember, spent nearly half a century, essentially, preparing for a war with the West. Not a war of aggression, but maybe a war of defense. I mean, you could argue that all day. Whereas it accumulated vast stocks of artillery, ammunition, huge stocks of this very robust long range and short range artillery. And it's shown that this other myth, this sort of think tank fantasy that Russia's running out of missiles. We've forgotten about that, haven't we? What happened to that? What happened to Russia running out of cruise missiles, running out of artillery shells? It's just fantasy. And you could ask any of the poor, unfortunate territorial defence infantrymen who've had 2 weeks training in the UK and are now sitting in a foxhole somewhere getting hammered by these Soviet-era artillery barrages. They will tell you very quickly that this war is unwinnable. But that doesn't transmit, as you say, to the NATO command, because I recently read a quote that people just don't want to see the delusion because it challenges the reality that they're in. And I think there's a very deep state of delusion at the political level. I think at a military level in Europe, and I know some people in that space, and they tell me that the only adults in the room right now are the senior military commanders in some of the NATO countries saying, look, guys, we couldn't win this war tomorrow if we started it with Russia. Forget about starting one with China. We just would not be able to win this conflict. We don't have the resources. I think all of the factories in Europe can manufacture a couple of 100,000 artillery shells a year. Russia has whole cities that manufacture nothing but artillery and armor. Tula, I was in Tula fairly recently on my way down to the south. And this is a city that was created in Soviet times to make artillery shells and bullets, essentially. And that's all it does. And Russia has 2 million people working in its arms industry now, 2 million people working, and they work hard and they produce very robust, very, efficient systems, and this reality seems to be lost on NATO. Everything they predicted has fallen on its ass. This econo-cultural war on Russia has failed in the most abject way. I met a very senior business person actually last night. I had a bit of lunch and then we had a drink. There is a huge buoyed mood here in the internal markets in Russia around industry, where Western companies have pulled out. There's a lot of innovation in technology. There's a very positive mood internally about that. And the indigenous arms industry, which is spinning up to a war from, Russia moves slowly, but when it gets going, momentum is vast. It's huge. And people here are also, I think now, not comfortable. Nobody's ever comfortable with war. And if there's a people alive on Earth who know war and know the horrors of war, it's got to be the Russian Soviet people who lost, 7 people here, and it's ingrained. These are tough people. They're very tough people, and they're beginning to understand that this war will have to be settled. I don't know if they consider it a victory even, because Ukraine is still seen here as a brotherly nation. They see Ukraine as a Slavic, it's a family row, for want of a better term. And there's still, deep sadness at the fact that this has occurred. So, I think that the levels of delusion in the West, and I suppose that would bring you to the NATO summit. The levels of delusion are absolutely remarkable. But what is the alternative for NATO? And as I said in my speech, and I think this might have annoyed them, I said the reality is that NATO cannot allow or must try to prevent a Russian military victory in Ukraine, because a Russian military victory in Ukraine means the end of NATO. It doesn't mean that they will immediately fold. NATO, of course, doesn't. But it means basically, why would any country want to be in NATO? What could NATO do for Ukraine? What did NATO do for Georgia? NATO can fight wars against, guerrillas or third-rate, Iraqi conscripts. Of course they can. It's like shooting fish in a. But they're defeated by the Taliban as the guerrilla conflict, which was geostrategy in true geostrategic warfare, in that they couldn't get into the mountains to defeat them. So this was a remarkable conflict in itself for another day maybe. But the reality is now that Russia is an advanced economy, despite what they tell you in the West. Oh, the Russian GDP is less than Texas or California. But what does Russia make? Russia makes T-90M tanks. Russia makes satellites. Russia makes the best anti-armor system on earth, probably the Cornet M right now. It's vaporizing everything NATO has. That's why the Challenger tank hasn't been seen, and that's why the Abrams hasn't been seen. Because one advertisement you don't want to give to your potential market is burning tanks. I mean, I don't know who'd want to buy a Leopard right now. I mean, it's not looking too good. The advertising campaign ain't going too well. And this whole using Ukraine as a laboratory for Western weapons, which is absolutely most certainly going on, is also another cynical element to this. Why is this war still going on? Why is this war is over? We can't have any presidential elections. So what's the impetus and, why would he want to end this war? Who does Zelensky become if there's peace? You have to actually do some real work. You have to become a politician, not just a fantasist comedian dressed in a green suit, trotting around Europe, being a rock star, because that's what he is to a lot of people. So the realities of the end of the war are so unpalatable for NATO, for the military-industrial complex, who are already concerned about the way this thing has gone, of course, is so unpalatable and unbelievable. It's informing the political reality, which is we just have to keep it going, hoping something else happens. And the danger is the big distraction that could end Ukraine, just like the big distraction that ended COVID, was a war. So where would we have that war? Potentially in China, potentially let's shift the focus into Taiwan. Who knows where the web, I don't know. But so this is the delusion of the Western hegemonic war machine. It tends to skip, like the Americans still had sand in their boots after being chased out of Afghanistan when they embarked on this insane proxy war with Russia. And who's to say that they won't do the same and jump towards
We appear to have lost you there for a bit. But I think that the point is very well made. And you also called Zelensky a rock star. Well, looking at that photo that we referenced from the NATO Summit where he's standing there glowering while his wife holds hands with someone else and everybody else is talking to everybody but him and is dressed nicely, whereas he kind of looks like he arrived from some sort of bad work casual event where he hasn't slept or bathed in 2 days. I would say that perhaps his rock star luster is beginning to fade a bit, but perhaps there's more than meets the eye. But what do you make of that much touted, vaunted thing where instead of NATO giving security guarantees, it's going to be the G7 and individual nations from that which will at some time in the future give security guarantees, and essentially it was a restatement of we're going to keep doing what we are doing without anything new really for Ukraine. What was up with that, and especially the Ukrainian outbursts?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting, this idea that you would shift guarantee conduit, or that any deals done with Ukraine would be done by individual countries. If you look at NATO, the whole basis for NATO is collective defense, right? So NATO was established in 1949, I think, as a collective defense pact for the North Atlantic. I just need the clues in the name. So basically what NATO has now accepted and agreed in the last 3 days is that we are no longer going to collectively agree to defend anybody, prospective members or incoming members. So they said it'll be up to individual countries and the G7. The G7 isn't a cohesive pact or alliance. There's no G7 charter which is signed. You don't become a member and have obligations economically or militarily to that. So that's an acceptance that NATO is impotent now. And this also informs the other reality is Erdogan going to dispatch a couple of brigades of Turkish paratroopers into Estonia if there was an incursion by Russia on the basis of the significant minority of Russian-speaking ethnic Russians there being increasingly oppressed as they are in many Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, etc. So the reality of NATO is this, okay? It's a club. It's a golf club. It's a club where we train and we drink and we eat and we have, we have parties, and we don't really play that much golf, okay? But these guys are turning up saying, you need to come and play golf now. No, thanks. We don't really want, we're here for the party. NATO is a machine that creates huge markets for the military industrial complex. And who is the beneficiary of that? It's the United States. Who is the main peddler of the fear narrative, which requires countries to be in NATO and spend a significant chunk of their GDP, particularly countries from the post-Soviet sphere who have underdeveloped economies and high levels of corruption and poor infrastructure. But NATO wants you to spend, I think 4% of your GDP, it might be less now, I'm not sure, on defense. Even Ireland now is sort of flirting with this deluded idea that Russia in some way eyes Ireland as some sort of strategic jump-off point for the Atlantic cables. It's a fancy, I mean, most people in Russia don't even know where Ireland is, and I know that because I spend a lot of time talking about it, explaining where my putrid little country is.
We do know that. I don't believe that. We do know where Ireland is, but I have to say we are definitely not planning to take over. I'm sorry to all of our Irish
But that's
listeners.
what you said. That's what you said about Ukraine. That's what they say to me. But that's what they said about Ukraine. I'm going, my God, I don't even want to go to Ireland, and I'm Irish. Most people I know who are Irish want to get off the island. Nobody wants to come. If we could do a deal where we could sell Ireland to the Russians, most people would say, fuck it, sell it. Let's get out of here.
Okay. Well, make an offer. We'll consider. I'm just kidding. But, as a Russian, what you said about the Eastern European countries, it's actually very funny because sometimes when people talk to me, like I talk to some people from Eastern Europe, I talk to some Polish people, and half of them seem to live in this fear of us invading them. And I'm like, there is literally no time in my day when I or anyone I know thinks about this in those terms.
It's a ludicrous idea. And the other thing is that this Russian Empire thing, and this is a good forum to talk about this, if I may, this idea that you support the Russian imperial fascist, that's not the fascist idiocy, that's insane, but this imperial idea that Russia wants to take over Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, but it decided to tackle the biggest land army in Europe instead. I mean, if Russia had imperial, designs, it would have just walked into the Balkans via Kaliningrad. It could have just took them over. Nobody's going to war over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Nobody. Not even the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. Nobody's going to war over these guys. Okay? Russia doesn't want it. Russia is a continent. The idea that Russia needs more land. It's just like fucking, it's like saying Hunter Biden needs, more cocaine. He probably has plenty, it's just insane.
It really is. But also, if you think about it, if you look at the USSR times, the Baltic states, they kind of were made this, I guess, an example of what the Soviet lifestyle would be. There was so much poured into them compared to the Russian regions. Yeah. And so literally a Baltic state to a Russia, not to mention the territory, but literally it is not worth it. I hate to sound like it, like a jerk maybe, but seriously, they have no resources. They literally have nothing of value to go to war over, which is something that I try to convey to people in the nicest way possible, that even if we look at it just from the very practical standpoint, there is no point in Russia trying to get those lands.
Yeah, but I mean, there's no strategic use for them either. The only reason they're worried about it is because they joined NATO, probably. I mean, I mean, the reality is that, Europe is in decline. It's in decline economically, and it's basically signed itself up for a slow death, the death of 1,000 cuts, because it's now sold its sovereignty, its economic sovereignty, and its geostrategic sovereignty to the United States. We all know who blew up the Nord Stream. There's a very, we all know why. We don't go into the Nord Stream. Sever Europe's, engine of production, its heavy industry, its automotive industry, its engineering capabilities in Germany and Italy from cheap Russian energy. And that's how you cripple Europe. That's how you make it a vassal economically. And it's all about the money. This is what the United States has done. They've done it quite masterfully. They've used the cover of this war to decapitate the capability of Europe for any economic growth now. There's also a tidal wave of immigration, which is very difficult when economies tank, and Europe, I believe, is the next cycle for Europe will be a significant slowdown in the economy, maybe from a colder winter next year, a prolonged war. If war with China comes, or even a limited military conflict, the financial markets will suffer, and everything will switch into these polarized markets of the United States or the yuan, whatever, and Europe will be left on its ass. It won't have any cheap Russian gas left. Why? Okay, we'll open it again. But this is the reality that Europe has done. So this sort of catalyst of this proxy war against Ukraine, I think it's actually spun out of control. I think these sort of National Endowment for Democracy crack acts who operate the State Department in the US, I think they miscalculated. They say, the favorite one on the teleprompter is, Russia has miscalculated. It strategically made a strategic mistake. Well, if you call demilitarizing NATO, because that's what's happened, they wouldn't be sending 30-year-old cluster munitions to its proxy. There wouldn't be 250,000 Ukrainian men under the ground dead, which is, I'm hearing now, as a reasonable estimate of dead and lost. There wouldn't be, for example, in Ireland, there's, we're heading for like 1 or 2% of the population is now Ukrainian. We've also got this migrant tidal wave hitting Europe, which is incredibly divisive in sort of liberal societies, because your liberalism tells you now everyone needs to get a house, but we've no house for the indigenous people. So you're going to have these huge fractious situations. Most of these migrants are the sediment, if you like, sorry for the term, from post-colonial wars in Africa, American hegemony in the Middle East, beginning in Iran, in the mid-1950s when Mohammad Mossadegh was deposed, where the British, French, and the Americans, combined to destroy a socialist Iran, which was the explosive charge that lit the Middle East. All of these people from Libya, Syria, sub-Saharan Africa are all they're all running from something, but running from the reality of this post-colonial world towards Europe, where they think they can make a living. And in my view, they should be able to do that. So Europe has a huge amount of problems. Russia, in my view, has huge internal capability. It's got vast natural resources. People are nervous. Nobody wants a war, of course. People are divided, they openly talk about it here. No, but I do sense now, after being here probably 6 months on this trip, that people are getting more resigned to the fact that this has to be done. It has to be ended. And I'm hearing more people talking that way. The idea of sort of Russia sitting down around a table with NATO or the representatives of NATO to do a deal that could brood with is becoming less and less likely, but who knows? But that's the sort of picture I see. And the NATO Summit, of course, is, as I mentioned, the idea that's trying to shift the responsibility. It's like, talk to your mother. This is what NATO is saying. The kids coming and saying, the guy up the road is bullying me. What am I going to do? Talk to your mother. Go to the G7. They'll mind you. I'm not going up there to get the crap kicked out of me, okay? Despite the fact that the father told the son, this time Zelensky, previously Saakashvili, go up there, see that big Russian at the bar, go up and smack him in the back of the head, okay? And when he turns around, we're all going to pile in. Saakashvili did it. Look at him. Look at him physically, look at him politically, look at him in every way now. He was sucked up this primrose path, as John Mearsheimer, the most, one of the greatest realist, geopolitical analysts alive today, painted this picture so beautifully and so, inimitably, so many times, and it's happened. Now Zelensky now in that vacuum. If you look at Vietnam, Dien Phu, the corrupt proxy leader that the Americans sucked into the conflict, accelerating the aid into Vietnam, and before they eventually, colluded with the South Vietnamese military to kill him. And they denied this for decades. But when the papers came out, it was the CIA and the American government had him whacked. So Zelensky's either going to go under a bus or start to become a pariah. And if there's a sniff of that right now, as that was the rock star comment, you're only as good as your last album. People fade away. So Zelensky's looking a bit chubby now. He's looking a bit stale. And he's also being called ungrateful, which is quite insulting, I don't remember Churchill calling Stalin ungrateful for asking for more Lend-Lease to bring across Lake Ladoga in the defense of, Leningrad. I don't remember that. These aren't statesmen. I didn't see these guys giggling over a cup of coffee while their people died in the Blitz or in the trenches on the Eastern Front. These were serious warrior leaders who knew what had to be done to defeat Nazism. Okay, whatever you think about them, this guy is an actor and a comedian, and he's an actor and a comedian paid by an utterly incompetent, demented, dishonest, and corrupt American president. So these are the people in charge, and it's pretty scary. So I just hope that the military people and the permanent government in the States and in the UK particularly are going to sort of wise up now and say, where can this go? Where can it go? Let's do some actual strategic planning. Where can this go? Is Russia going to accept a defeat in Ukraine, a military defeat? In my view, it's absolutely impossible for Russia to accept that. Vladimir Putin does not want the legacy of a defeat. And I don't see him allowing that to happen. The Russian military doesn't. Two very powerful complexes in Russia. Russian people, at least 60% of them, I would say, don't want that to happen. Nobody here wants to go back to the 90s where the West picked over the corpse of the Soviet Union, raped the natural resources, fueled a very lawless period here while Western operations made trillions of dollars, ripping apart the skeletal remains of the Soviet Union. Nobody here is going to allow that to happen. It's just not going to happen, okay? And I've talked to some very serious people about this, though. So the delusion is very strong in the West. Their club is under threat. They're losing their proxy war. Their economy is under pressure. And worse than anything else, their economy in the West, in the EU and NATO, which is the heartland of it, funded, of course, by the States, is under threat from their best friend, the Americans. And the Americans now want to start a fucking row with the Chinese. Who suffers from that mostly? It would be Europe. So this is a bad wedding where everyone's drunk on one side of the family, and it's going to end badly, in my view. So it's time for them to get around the table and start saying, where can this go? And where do we want to send it? Because if that doesn't happen, we could have a serious problem.
Do you think that they even care? Because, judging by, their emotions and their mannerisms and the way they acted at the NATO summit, they don't care. It feels like Zelensky cares, obviously. But I
think they do care. I think, listen, here's the thing. There's an awful lot of middle-aged white men who stand to lose an awful lot of money, influence, and legacy from this ending badly. And sometimes, you got to be pragmatic. I think in the West and in the United States, for example, a presidential election coming up, it's never good to run an election during a war in the States. I think, Nixon prolonged the Vietnam War so that he could get reelected. It was, I think, McNamara, his strategist, sort of, colluded with him, thousands of Americans died so that this war wouldn't end or the defeat wouldn't come on his watch. The same with Afghanistan. Biden said that, it was all Trump's fault. But a State Department report 2 weeks ago, which I did a report on here, patently verified that Biden was complicit in the calamitous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the defeat of the American military. So they have to become pragmatic now, because the alternative is unthinkable. I mean, the alternative is a NATO Russia war. And remember, people in the NATO side and these the deluded NAFO NATO people, they believe that this conflict will be limited to NATO Russia. They forget that NATO Russia has allies. And could China be pulled into a conflict with Russia on a broader front or scale? Well, think about it. What would be the first thing you would do? Is when the fight breaks out in the bars, you grab the bottles of whiskey and you run out of the car park, as we say in Ireland. So would China use the opportunity to take Taiwan while America's back was turned in a land war in Europe? It's just unthinkable. And there are too many middle-aged white men with too much money in the bank, too many investments, too many seats on too many boards, to let that happen, in my view. And I'm relying on their greed and hopeful rearmament around Taiwan to pull them out of Ukraine as they were pulled out of Afghanistan when they saw that the game was over. I don't think they're going to realize it till the last minute, but I think a couple of Russian Guards armies might have a say in that when this ludicrous assault against these fixed defenses is exhausted. And it's, in my view, it's very much heading in that direction. I believe that there will probably be, and the military, the strategic mind, and if you read the stuff I read and you're looking at this on a sort of a whiteboard, the absolute imperative now would be for Russia to engage in a counterattack and head along the Black Sea coast toward Odessa, towards Transnistria. That's my view. I don't know, will they do it? I don't know, is there the political will to do it? Would it need more mobilization? I don't know. But that's what the encyclopedia would tell you would have to do. Because you leave this sort of open sword, you allow this thing the next chapter of this conflict to be fought by your kids and grandkids. I don't know.
All right, like a nice little closing segue. Why do you think that Ukraine thought that they would be any different than Georgia?
I think you got to remember, I think the ideology behind this whole Maidan thing was, it was funded and accelerated by National Democracy Freedom House. It was hollowed out from the inside, and very dangerous people were put on the stage with people like McCain. And John McCain, a repugnant, horrible little man, never saw war he didn't want to be involved in. A really unpleasant creature, Lindsey Graham. Sometimes the people who shout loudest, get most of the airtime. And I think Ukraine, to some degree, initially was seduced into this idea that it was a superior race. I mean, they've rewritten history in so many ways now, it's laughable. But I think this far right, particularly in economies and societies which are suffering terrible deprivation, and in post-Soviet Ukraine was exceptionally corrupt, exceptionally poor, exceptionally dysfunctional and dangerous place to be. So in these spaces, as Germany post-First World War, it's a very fertile ground for radicalism. And you don't just need to be a radical. You need to be lucky, as even Hitler was and believed he was lucky. If you want to shine like the sun, first you got to burn like the sun. So this was this firebrand ideology that the EU was going to be all things to us Ukrainians. We're going home. But this was a very small group, very vocal, with a very distinct heritage back to the OUN, the UPA, these banderists, terrorists, Nazis, collaborators, who have even whitewashed that into some sort of noble nationalist freedom movement. I think they had this disproportionate influence that everything was going to be fixed if we joined the EU. We got rid of Yanukovych, who was democratically elected. The Americans, of course, they have no morality when they select their bedfellows when the outcome is going to be damage or a strategic defeat on their enemy. So they would get into bed with the Pedophiles Association of Hades if it meant damaging Russia or China's interests globally. They've shown that with ISIS, with their collusion with Nazis, with their
what is it? Is Al Qaeda
the
our
Third
friends?
Reich.
Al Qaeda are our friends.
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, but look, who became the chief police in East Germany, or sorry, West Germany? It was Paulus, the head of the Sixth Army that was captured at the siege of Stalingrad. He became the chief of police. The Marshall Plan was basically pumping oxygen into this Nazi cadaver to grow it, to build it as a wall against communism. So this project has been ongoing for decades. It's nothing new. Operation Unthinkable, where the British and the Americans were, actually considering colluding to strike 12 Soviet cities with nuclear weapons, decapitate the Soviet regime, and steal the resources of Russia. Those documents exist in the Q archive, and I'd suggest anyone who has any issue with anything I've said, go and search out the factual basis for everything I've said. So this is nothing new. So this is the terminus of a bad idea. And it doesn't mean that somebody can say on the Western side, well, this was a bad idea. Let's go and start another idea somewhere, like they did in Afghanistan, and move on. I don't suggest for a second that they're even aware of how bad they are at this stuff, at foreign policy. I don't suggest that they are, or they will be. But there will always be a selfish imperative which may save us from the ultimate disaster. Why is Ukraine become this enthusiastic, I actually called what's happening in Ukraine a vast assisted suicide program run by the CIA and MI6. And that's what I think it is. It's an assisted suicide program. I don't buy into all this replacement theory or trying to wipe out a generation, or the idea that this war is based on a huge BlackRock sort of investment scam. I don't buy into that. This is idiotic foreign policy. This is a vastly funded and aggressive U.S. Military industrial complex, which the nexus of which into U.S. politics is so pernicious and incestuous. It's terrifying. These two coalescing sort of parasitic organisms are hungry for fear. So you create fear around Russia, you create fear around Islam, you create fear around China. You find somebody to flood with weapons, then you get them to suck in the weapons from their surrounding countries while flooding them with fear. You replace the weapons in the surrounding countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Italy, Germany, and you perpetuate this massive profit machine, which sucks in human beings and spits out vast profits for people like Lloyd Austin, the American Secretary of Defense, who was a board member of Raytheon. Max Blumenthal took it apart like a leg set at the UN. He was absolutely masterful. And I'd suggest everybody listen to his speech, which was an incredible indictment of this grimy nexus between the military industrial complex and American political life. So I think Ukraine has become this enthusiastic sacrificial lamb for the West. But I think people are going to start to see that. I think in Georgia, they really believed that because they were so close to Russia, they would be far more important, in my view. I think Saakashvili was an idiot as well. But he was, in some ways, politically tuned in, whereas Zelensky is just a vacuous, dead-eyed, Borg, really. He's just terrifyingly inept, in my view. He's just an actor.
Well, the actor and the stage, and he was on that stage all alone. I think that's quite a good note to end on. Chay, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing our insights. It was wonderful to have you again. I've learned quite a bit. I know our listeners will learn quite a bit listening to you. I would also like to take this opportunity to bring attention to a new feature that we've launched here at DD Geopolitics, our Substack. We have a dedicated team here, and we write articles for you. It's for free, but if you want to support us, the best way to do that is to subscribe to our Substack. Now, thank you all once again, and Chay, thank you again, and thank you, Chebu, thank you, Lydia.